Hi everyone, Travis Ragsdale with WDRB Investigates, joined today by Chris Otts, WDRB.com reporter. We're trying to introduce you guys to some of the web reporters that we have on our team here. Chris covers business and the economy for us. And so today we're going to talk about the story that you and Marcus Green wrote, Prospect Cove. It seems like I've been hearing about Prospect Cove for years. I think we started reporting on this back in 2016, 2017. This is a development, an affordable housing development just on the border of Prospect. And ever since it's been proposed, there has been opposition. So let's go back to some of your reporting originally and how this issue first came to the forefront of a lot of people's minds.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was back in 2016 that the developer, they're required to do this. They had a neighborhood meeting out there to explain what is this apartment complex that we want to build. And so let's back up and get a few things straight. So one of the things that's going on here is that the developer in the case is a company called LDG. And they are by far the biggest affordable housing developer, I would say, at least on the for-profit side in Louisville.
It's almost all they do.
Yeah, they are incredibly active with this. And what is, affordable housing is a term that's kind of thrown around and sometimes vague. So let's define some terms here. So affordable housing is subsidized by the federal government. Basically, the way that these apartment complexes that LDG builds are financed is through these federal programs that give them access to money at a below market rate, I believe. And then the investors in that are able to get tax credits. And the quid pro quo there is that the projects that they build are reserved for people who make a certain income that has to be below the average family income in the area. There are calculations every year as to what those income limits are based on how many people. But to give you a rough idea, what they want to do here in Prospect is have an apartment complex with 178 units. And these units would be reserved for people at different income thresholds. But the bottom line is that the most income that you could earn as a family would be somewhere around the low 60s in terms of an annual income. And to compare that, the typical family income in Louisville is more like 75, 78, and in Prospect it's 175,000.
So a big difference.
So it's a big difference in terms of the types of tenants that would be there. Additionally, I think part of why this has stirred up so much controversy is that Prospect is a owner-occupied community.
It's almost over 90%.
Over 92% of people who live in 40059, which is either the wealthiest zip code or the second wealthiest zip code in the state, own their homes. And in Jefferson County as a whole, that's only about 61%. So they have a very high rate of single-family home ownership there. It's an overwhelmingly white community. There are some pockets historically of African Americans in Prospect, certain neighborhoods, but they're small. And the overall view of the zip code is that it is overwhelmingly white. And so the idea is to have a place that is affordable for working families, for people who are in sort of blue-collar jobs. And there's a tremendous shortage of affordable housing, we're often told, throughout the community. Yeah. And one of the things that pretty much everyone in elected office in Louisville agrees is that we need more affordable housing. So everybody agrees with that as a sort of first principle, right? What we've seen time and time again is that when the rubber meets the road, when it actually comes time to propose an affordable housing development, often the people who live nearby are not in favor of that development in that particular place at this particular time. They think affordable housing is good, but not necessarily where they live.
Right.
So this is not limited to the people in Prospect. We've seen opposition to many other LDG projects, and it is a big, it's a big source of concern. I think one of the things here, Travis, too, is, we have a lot of, in the United States, we have a lot of wealth tied up in home ownership, right? And so one of the visceral fears is that changes to a neighborhood will decrease property values.
That's the argument you
Yeah.
always hear
Right.
when these developments are proposed.
Correct.
And have public meetings.
Yeah.
That's what you hear over and over again.
Correct.
Is this concern that
Yes.
it will diminish somebody's property value.
Yeah, yes. And that is, I think in some sense that's an understandable concern. I think there's debate. I think there's academic literature on whether that's actually true,
Yeah.
whether it happens. But when you're looking at this and trying to figure out where is all this sort of vehement opposition, this kind of sort of visceral fears that we see when these things are proposed, I think that's probably the sort of overriding explanation, is that people have a ton invested when they own their home. They can't easily get out of that. It's a big, ordeal to move or to sell, and they worry about that investment. And, I think that's probably underneath the surface animating a lot of the general opposition, not just talking about Prospect, but everywhere that we see when affordable housing is proposed. And another thing we should say is that where is the affordable housing in Jefferson County? If we're talking about Section 8, any sort of units that are subsidized by the federal government, it's primarily in West Louisville and South Louisville. And so one of the overall goals of policymakers in Louisville is to spread that out, to see more of that in eastern Jefferson County. But it's often difficult when they're actually proposed.
But this has kind of been the poster child for this argument, right? At least here over the last several years. I think obviously part of that, you alluded to it earlier, there was this meeting, this planning commission meeting that was attended by hundreds of people. They had to have it in an auditorium because there were so many people from Prospect that came to oppose this. And because of some of the things that were said in that meeting, LDG, the developer, actually filed a lawsuit to kind of fight that fight.
Let's talk about what actually happened 5 years ago. So the Planning Commission, which is a group appointed by the mayor of Louisville, and they take their cues from the professional planning staff for the city, for Metro government. And this body reviews requests from developers to change the zoning on particular pieces of property so that they can effectuate whatever plans they have. And the Planning Commission recommended the zoning change for Prospect Cove. The Metro Council is actually the final authority on these zoning changes, but 99% of the time, I would say, the Metro Council goes along with whatever the Planning Commission recommends. The Planning Commission is really the ones who deal in depth with what is going to be built where and what are the ramifications.
Metro Council
of that.
typically takes the recommendation.
It's largely a rubber stamp.
Yeah.
But they do have discretion, and in the Prospect Cove case, there was a ton of opposition, and Metro Council narrowly voted it down, 14-11, back in 2017. LDG is suing Metro government, claiming that this denial of the zoning change was really motivated by the socioeconomic status, the race, the age, disability status of the potential residents of Prospect Cove, and that violates the Federal Fair Housing Act and the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. And so LDG is seeking damages from not having been able to build this development 5 years ago. And in addition, they are not backing down. they've revised the plan, downscaled it a little bit, but they're trying once again for a second zoning change to make this a reality.
Well, and that's how kind of we've gotten to this point now, is that the first thing, it's kind of twofold, really. We have that lawsuit that Chris mentioned was amended and has some new and I would call salacious accusations in it. But also, the second prong of that is what Chris mentioned. These plans have been revised slightly. I think we're down to 175 units versus 198.
I think it's 178.
Okay.
Yep.
So slightly fewer units, and instead
3
of
stories instead of 4.
and instead of senior housing,
Yeah, it's now, there's no age
Yes,
restriction.
correct.
Before, I think they were limiting it to the tenant had to be 55 or older.
right. And so now this is going to go back through that whole process, through the Planning Commission.
And we should mention Tuesday night, October 18th, is another one of these nighttime public hearings
Right.
that the Planning Commission is holding. They do that by request when people come forward and say there's a lot of interest in this project and you need to have the hearing at night in a place convenient to the area. So it's going to be at Kentucky Country Day School. Normally it would be at 1 o'clock, downtown. And so they do this in the case of high interest projects, and we don't know how many people are going to show up, whether it's going to be just like it was 5 years ago, but we know the mayor has put it out there and said,
Right. Mayor
we're hoping to
Prospect.
have a big turnout.
Yeah, and so it'll go to the Planning Commission, they'll make a recommendation, and then ultimately Metro Council has to decide again. What will be interesting to me to see is, given that there was so much public interest and reporting, frankly, on this issue and pressure, and you have this lawsuit that's still pending, whether Metro Council is going to have the same kind of tight vote on this as they did previously, because certainly they don't want to go through all this again, you would think, but it kind of remains to be seen, right?
Yeah, no, I think we really have no idea, and I've not polled the Metro Council people as to whether their opinion on this has changed. I mean, I think, so this was 5 years ago, so one thing you're going to be looking at is that the membership of Metro Council will be a different, and additionally, we don't know who is necessarily going to even be on the Metro Council, because this thing is probably not going to make it to the council's docket before the changeover that happens after the November election. I think, I think that remains to be seen. But that's one possibility, is that we don't even know the composition of the Metro Council. But I think, for the 14 who voted against it, if they were not in favor of it then, based on size and scale and compatibility with the neighborhood, what's proposed today is really not all that different. Now, LDG would say that it was always compatible with and the comprehensive plan of the city, and that the real reason that it was denied in the first place was not above board.
Well, and so you mentioned that, the lawsuit claims that the opposition to this was based on those socioeconomic factors, race, income level, disability status. And we were able to talk to the mayor of Prospect about some of those things this past week. And I think it's important for you to hear what he said when asked about whether this was about the functionality and whether the development fit in, or whether this was about those socioeconomic factors.
I will say, however, that as far as racial stuff is concerned, until recently, my next door neighbor was an African American, hell of a nice guy. And currently, he moved away, and the people who live there now are Hispanic. And the only problem with that is that we can't talk to each other, because I don't speak their language and they don't speak mine.
So, and that's been publicly, at least, the argument from Prospect and the people who have voted against this from the beginning, is that this just doesn't fit this particular area, and that's why we don't want it. So, you know, a lot of this is, it's kind of repeating itself. It's where it's a little bit Groundhog Day-ish around here reporting on this, because it's very similar to what we did before, but, you know, obviously it's something that I'm sure you'll continue to follow, and we'll have more reporting on.
We should talk about, you know, one other objection that has been raised and was raised back then, which
I think I know what you're talking about.
Yes, the gas station, the fact that this development would be built near the Kroger gas station, and you know, the professional people who reviewed this for the city never raised an issue with that. I believe there are sort of state guidelines on proximity to gas stations, but the Prospect people have raised this as a primary objection to the development, and of course LDG had something to say about that in their lawsuit, where they said, well, you were raising money to do a different development there with a public park and with other apartments and offices and restaurants, and so weren't you concerned about the gas station fumes from those? And the mayor of Prospect told us that, well, if you had a different development, you could sort of move it farther away from.
There's been all kinds of back and forth between the two.
I think there were, in 2017, I believe there were 2 doctors who lived in the area who came to the public hearing and brought up the gas station.
Could be the gas fumes. Could be
originally. I mean, we heard all kinds of things. I mean, I remember reporting on this many years ago, and somebody called me up and said, "Did you know that the Harrods Creek Fire Department doesn't even have a ladder truck that could get high enough?"
Yeah, I do remember that. I seem to remember something.
And you know, when communities expand and they build new stuff, those new buildings are paying property taxes, and those property taxes fund the fire district. And so, you know, when a community grows, oftentimes the services also naturally grow because they're getting more tax revenue and they need to be appropriate for what's built in the community. But I think, you know, to see those kinds of reasons coming out as opposition to this really just underscores the sort of deeply held anxieties that people in the area have about this proposal.
Yeah, and it's a story we'll continue to follow. We've been following it for six years now.
Should be fun.
So we'll keep at it. You can read Chris and Marcus's story online right now at WDRB.com.